learners. This is the second part of Unit 12 of MGPE 14, Antyodaya to Sarvodaya. In this particular section, we'll be talking about the economics of Sarvodaya, the political philosophy of Sarvodaya, as well as its philosophical potential. So let's begin with the economics of Sarvodaya. For a realistic interpretation of the Gandhian Sarvodaya concept and its present relevance in building a non-violent social order, we must consider its specific socio-cultural and socio-individual background. Sarvodaya provides almost a communistic or almost a socialist approach to wealth, with its emphasis on redistribution and equal rights and entitlements of all. And we've discussed this in the earlier video. Vinoba Bhave, one of the very, very important proponents of Sarvodaya, held that God is the supreme owner of all things in the world, and hence individuals who are mortal should not claim personal ownership over land. So this is a very, very interesting way of conceptualizing the problem or the issue of private property. Vinoba further said that all the great saints in this country have taught that land should not be kept under personal or private ownership. Modern Sarvodaya also extends the Gandhian conception of trusteeship, which we have discussed earlier. In the context of the tremendous social and economic crisis of the present-day world, Sarvodaya stands for egalitarian social and economic structures. It pleads for the repudiation or the denial of the proprietary possession or malkiyat of the non-producers, the establishment of the proprietary possession or malkiyat of the producers, and the neutralization or the negation of ownership. It hopes to establish a society of producers or laborers, basically persons who work by the sweat of their brow, who produce goods, who produce food, who produce the things that human beings consume. Two of the very, very important concepts underlying the Sarvodaya movement that was popularized by Bhave, among others, are the notions of Bhudan and Sampatidan. And these are regarded as steps towards the realization of the kind of society where those who labor, the workers, are the ones who really are the drivers of the society. Bhudan refers to the redistribution of land without the payment of any compensations. Landholders are asked to keep only that portion which is essential for their requirements and surrender the rest to the community. So this is indeed a very, very revolutionary idea, that those who have excess land are asked to give it back to the community. It is not forced from them, it is a voluntary action. They may keep what they need for their own livelihood and give the rest to society. The protagonists, or those who propagate Bhudan, believe that all wealth has a social origin. Wealth is something that society gives us. And hence they interpret this surrender by the landholders as an act of giving to the community what really belongs to it. So once again, to reiterate the notion that land or property is not something that belongs to the individual, it is something that belongs to society. And therefore, we have the duty to render unto society that which we have got from it. If Bhudan and Gramdan are techniques of agrarian revolution based on moral force, Sampatidan is a significant part in the transformation of capitalism into the Sarvodaya society. For the realization of Sampatidan, so Sampatidan basically means giving away property, giving away wealth. 1/6 of one's wealth to begin with should be utilized for the sake of society. According to Jayaprakash Narayan, and I quote, "The next step is that of full trusteeship. Under trusteeship, commercial and industrial enterprises would belong to the society, and there would be no employer and employee. The management and labor would have joint responsibility to run them, not for themselves, but for the good of society as a whole, unquote. This may sound like a utopian notion, but in terms of promoting social harmony, in terms of promoting the common good, this is an extremely thoughtful philosophy. Let's talk about the state and Sarvodaya. It has often been said that Sarvodaya has a kind of an element of philosophical anarchism about it. Sarvodaya accepts the sacrosanct character of the human spirit, and thus it emphasizes the values of freedom, equality, justice, and fraternity. Because of this, therefore, it is opposed to the machinery of the state, to some kind of artificial external regulation which regulates the activities of human beings. It sees the state as a soulless and mechanical instrument that is used by those with the power of manipulation, skill and cunning, and the capacity to control the governmental structure. So we see here a fundamental tension between the integrity, between the fundamental sacrosanct nature of human beings and an external regulatory mechanism like the contemporary state. In tracing the evolution of the state, this is what Vinoba Bhave had to say, and I quote, "In the early stage, it was unrestrained violence that held the faith. Gradually, man learned to curb and limit his violence, and the institution called the state came into existence. The formation of the state did limit violence up to a degree. The advent of the apparatus of government created a new kind of law and order. Even Vedas had said that coercive power of the state was personification of dharma. But gradually, the state grew stronger, became more and more powerful, till it became an all-powerful state with the power of destroying the whole world with its military might based on nuclear weapons." Vinoba Bhave said this in 1956. Bear in mind that ahimsa is the guiding faith, the fundamental philosophy that governs Gandhian philosophy, and therefore the capacity of the state for violence is something that is fundamentally in opposition to Gandhian ideals. In most cases, we see that the state does operate with the methods of intimidation, coercion, persecution, and organized violence. Hence, Gandhi was thoroughly opposed to the state. And remember, during the British rule, the worst, the cruelest excesses of the state were seen and were experienced by freedom fighters, including Gandhi himself. Gandhi pleaded for Swarajya, the inner rule of human beings over themselves. And Swarajya should be based on the moral sovereignty of the people rather than some external agency that would control them and that would oppress them. But while Gandhi believed in the spiritualization of politics, Vinoba Bhave stands almost for the nullification of politics. And Sarvodaya aims to replace thoroughly the manipulative politics of power by the participant politics of cooperation. So, from manipulation to cooperation and participation is the mool mantra, if you like, of Sarvodaya. According to Vinoba Bhave, there are 10 criteria of an ideal polity, and these are as follows: international fraternity, the conscious and spontaneous as far as possible, and hearty cooperation of all the inhabitants of the country, the identity of the good of the capable minority and the general majority, the orientation towards the universal and equal development of all, the widest dispersion of political sovereignty, the least amount of government, the easiest availability of tantra or justice, what is known as sulabtam tantra, the easiest or the most simple form of availability of justice, the least possible expenditure, the lowest degree of external protection, and the universal, uninterrupted and neutral or objective spread of knowledge. These, according to Vinoba Bhave, were the elements of the ideal polity. Let's talk a little bit about the political implications of Sarvodaya. To begin with, let's look at the repudiation of the Marxist theory of class struggle that is posited by Sarvodaya. So even though Sarvodaya has got many elements in common with socialism and communism, we see that the Marxian theory of class struggle and class conflict is in a sense opposed or is contradicted or contravened by Sarvodaya. So the fundamental theme of Sarvodaya, as we have discussed, is the realization of the happiness and elevation of all. It repudiates or denies the theory of class struggle and believes in safeguarding the interests and rights of the minority. Now, the concept of class struggle, which is very fundamental in Marxist thinking, is based upon the acceptance of the existence of divergent and even antithetical interests in the social structure. So Marxist theory is premised on the belief that there are classes which are contradictory, whose interests are contradictory and who are in conflict with each other. And this conflict will result in a violent upsurge and an overthrow or an overturning of the oppressive caste, that will result in the overthrow of the oppressive class by the class that mobilizes, by the class that has been oppressed by the dominant classes. Sarvodaya, on the other hand, starts with the idea of the community as a reality, almost sui generis, and it holds that the aim of social and political efforts is to optimize the good of the entire community. So this is the fundamental difference. Sarvodaya stresses the need for disinterested service, dedication, and the realization of the common good. As we discussed, it is opposed to the Marxist theory of class struggle, which favors the violent overthrow of the oppressive structures and the oppressive classes. Once we accept that violence has to be renounced, has to be completely given up as a basis of organized social existence, it stands to reason that there is no place for the theory of mutually antagonistic classes under the thinking of Sarvodaya. Sarvodaya pleads for the replacement of the concept of class struggle by a more rational and organic theory of social good and social harmony. This social harmony is not just a matter of talk, but it is something that is to be experienced in our daily conduct. There has to be a deliberate extension of good feelings. And the aim here is not forcibly expropriating or taking away the wealth of the rich, but rather a conscious and spontaneous practice of sharing the goods one has ready at hand. So see the difference. This is not about taking away those things that the haves have and giving it to the have-nots, but rather creating a social order where there would be voluntary sharing, there would be a placing of the common good and of social welfare as the fundamental aim of human existence. In this way, the ideal of sharing and a mass moral revolution oriented towards peaceful social reconstruction can be brought about. The aim of this revolution is not to seize power, but to bring about a change in one's outlook and the hierarchy of values. The propensity or the tendency to accumulate has to give place or has to give way to the propensity to share. But the repudiation of the concept of class struggle and the acceptance of the ideal of social harmony in no way means that the status quo should be allowed to perpetuate. The status quo with landlords, big farmers on one side, and small farmers and agricultural laborers on the other, and the smaller groups or the agricultural laborers and the smaller farmers being exploited by the big farmers, by the zamindars. This is not something, this kind of status quo is not something that is to be promoted under any circumstances. In his earlier days of political leadership, Gandhi was in fact in favor of retaining the zamindari system. But later on, his views underwent a radical transformation, and he talked about a social structure which was rid of all class stratification. Sarvodaya wants to bring about social and economic equality. As we've seen, Sarvodaya and communism or socialism both accept social equality. However, the vital difference is found in the profound attachment of Sarvodaya to the ethics and the techniques of non-violence. And Sarvodaya, in fact, contemplates a regime of equality and justice, which is to be brought about by the dynamic transforming power of love and non-violence. Another very important political implication of Sarvodaya is the repudiation of the concept of majoritarianism. Since Sarvodaya implies that the community is an organic structure and all the individuals within the community are bearers of moral and cultural values, obviously it stands to reason that there is no place for jeopardizing the interests of the weakest and the most marginal members. Consensus and not majority is the operating principle here, as membership or non-membership to a majority community or a majority party is simply a matter of chance. Discussion and debate, and through argument and counter-argument, we will find fundamental areas of mutual goodwill. And this is the way in which different groups or different factions, different communities can cooperate to ease their differences. This, and not the numerical counting of heads, is the genuine method of social action. So sheer brute numbers cannot determine or cannot be held as being the sole determining factor of what view will prevail. The view that prevails should be the view that emerges out of mutual consultation, mutual dialogue, and a certain amount of discussion which will lead to certain common areas of social action. So the view of the brute majority is not the view that has to be perforce accepted by the entire community. According to Sarvodaya, the concept of majoritarianism has to be replaced by the concept of consensus. The various safeguards of proportional representation that were devised to protect the interests of the minority groups are not sufficient as per this thinking. And numerical criteria of many and few have to be replaced by adhering to the good of the community. So merely by talking about numbers is not enough. We have to think about the common good of the community as a whole. It is seen that different types of parties and associations grow in response to diverse social interests of diverse social groups. However, as per the Sarvodaya philosophy, this kind of conception of plurality is a mechanistic one, it's a mechanical one. And this has to be replaced by a moral conception, which is based upon the unity of the fundamental interests of the society. So there are certain common principles, there are certain commonly held values which have to be emphasized rather than narrow sectarian ideas. And thus Sarvodaya aims to replace the concept of majoritarianism by the concept of fundamental consensus. Let us sum up. For Gandhi, Sarvodaya stands for the merger of one in all with self-sacrifice and selfless service. Sarvodaya stands for the welfare of all, the universal welfare and the integrated development of all. As a universal ideal, it aims at not only fulfilling the minimum material needs, but also in developing the ethico-spiritual aspects of all human beings. And the great contribution of Sarvodaya in the present times lies in the reassertion of the Gandhian moral approach to the problems of humanity. So these notions, these ideas of Gandhi have an immense relevance and an immense value till today. And the learners are encouraged to think through these, to try and apply them to the situations that you see around you, and try and see how these fundamental principles, how these very, very important ideas may be used or may be put into practice in our contemporary times. Thank you.